So we are recording now, and I am very happy to introduce Calvin Baker, and I hope that's how you pronounce your name, Calvin Baker, who is zooming in for us from the University of Auckland. Calvin is a research fellow and a professional teaching fellow. Calvin is also a voice teacher, teaching a wide range of age groups and also different interest groups. Calvin is very interdisciplinary and also transdisciplinary. You work with speech science, but also you work in School of Music. You focus on the voice, of course, otherwise we wouldn't be here, and psychology. You have done work on female adolescent voice change. You are also interested in instrumental analysis of the singing voice and healthcare, more specifically preventive care. And you've been collaborating with people all over the world. Yes. And we are excited to hear about your research in today's talk.
Lovely. Thank you so much. That's very succinct and all accurate. So lovely. It's a pleasure to be here and nice to meet some of you. I'll just start this sharing here. So as Misha said, I'm a honorary research fellow in speech science in the School of Psychology, and a PCF professional teaching fellow in School of Music. I'm also a member of the Speech and Swallow Lab in the University of Auckland Clinics, and within there specialize in voice research specifically, and also singing voice rehabilitation. So working with people who are professional singing voice users after they've had treatment from laryngologists or SLTs, but also some who have some remedial work they need to have done on the singing voice specifically. So I thought just to start, I would give you a little bit of background into me and how I sort of arrived here very briefly. I started off as a singer. My undergraduate degree was in classical performance. I'm a tenor. And throughout that undergrad degree, I really developed a love and interest in voice technique, singing technique, but also vocal function and sort of the anatomy and acoustics of the singing voice. So I moved into honors degree, and that was in studio pedagogy with a focus on teaching voice in one-on-one or small group contexts. And that moved into a master's degree in music, and that research was looking at specifically male adolescent voice change. And at the time I was teaching in secondary schools and saw, the effects of the voice change. And the idea was looking at how we can teach singing through that age in a way that facilitates healthy and effective and efficient singing voice use. Throughout that work, I saw that actually the real big gap in the literature was around the female adolescent voice. We know a lot about the male voice actually, and it's probably just because it's so clear and so obvious to everyone that we know so much. But looking at the female voice was quite interesting. So my PhD actually started in music, looking at the female adolescent voice change, specifically around the singing voice and how the singing voice was affected. Then a little bit later on, the PhD actually changed discipline into speech science, and for reasons that we will see a little bit today. So some of those initial questions were looking at, again, singing voice change through adolescence. So measuring, monitoring change and establishing norms, and the norms is in, quotation marks, because the idea of normal with the voice can be a little bit contentious anyway. It was also looking at assessment practice and criteria, and how actually these are misaligned with physiological development in most cases. The New Zealand criteria in secondary schools for assessing voice sort of implicitly imply a linear relationship between chronological age and skeletal age, but we know that that's really not the case, and there can be big discrepancies. So, a female adolescent singer of two of the same age might be at very different stages biologically, and that would reflect in the voice as well. And so much more work was needed in that area. So we conducted some research there, and I conducted two studies. One looking at the perceptions and experiences of adolescent female voice users and singers throughout New Zealand, and how they perceived their own voice change. And then looking at a small cohort of singers in Auckland, measuring some singing voice tasks instrumentally, and looking at the wide range of norm within that healthy cohort. It was through that research, though, that I saw actually, and the question came up, are the tools that we might use to measure the singing voice and to analyze the singing voice, are they actually suitable for the singing voice and for singing voice analysis? And this question scared me, because I thought, well, what's the point of doing this research if actually the tools we might use are not robust or capable of really looking at what we want them to look at with the singing voice. So at this point, I'm not sure the background of everyone who might be watching or listening. I saw a lot of linguistics and English in the list. So a very basic overview of the voice production. So we're looking at this model that's a linear model. It's quite simple, but it is a lovely way to look at the voice. Power, source, and filter. So the power, as it sounds, is the fuel. It's the driving force for vocal fold vibration. So there's air pressure below the vocal folds that, when that's set into motion through myoelastic and pressure differences, the vocal folds come together and they begin oscillation. And that's the point of the sound source. And the source of the singing voice, the human voice sound, is predominantly the vocal folds themselves. These are multi-layered, symmetrical pair of very small little sort of folds of tissue, and about the size of a thumbnail. And they come together, if we're looking down into the trachea, come together and they vibrate to create sound. That sound is then filtered through the vocal tract. And this is where, through the resonant properties of the vocal tract, some of the harmonics of the sound source created here are amplified and others are dampened. And we also have additive noise in speech, and that's created in the vocal tract, and that's where we get the sounds that we hear in speech. That's what's transmitted. That's how we transmit that information. Looking at the vocal folds themselves, I find them incredible and quite beautiful, but I'm biased here, obviously. We have the sort of deepest layers, and again, this is quite a quick overview of everything. Deepest layer of the thyroarytenoid muscle. This is the muscular bulk of the vocal fold. We have the vocal ligament within here, and that's responsible for the fine changes in tension in the vocal fold. So that's a lot to do with pitch and fundamental frequency. We have the lamina propria, and that's 3 layers of mucosa of differing viscosity. So the deepest layer is the most dense and the most sort of rigid, and then intermediate and superficial, and they kind of get more loose as we move up to the superficial layer. And then we have the epithelium covering everything, which is stratified squamous cell, and that's the same cells as throughout the vocal tract. And that acts as a barrier to pathogens. It's a very important role in the vocal fold health, and also it obviously holds that lamina propria structure together. And the way the vocal fold is structured allows for this beautiful wave of the vocal fold when they're vibrating, independent of the body of the vocal fold. And that's really, really important for healthy and efficient vocal function. And so just briefly here, we've got a pitch glide in a healthy, to be honest, I'm not sure if this is a singer or a speaker, but we've got a pitch glide, low to high, and a register change in here. And you can see this motion. So a beautiful mucosal wave here. We're getting higher in pitch. The vocal folds are stretching. Then we have a voice break there, and the vibration becomes regular, a little bit chaotic, and then it's back into a periodic vibration there. So you can see that sort of nice and slowly, good vocal fold contact, then through this pitch break, and the vocal folds freak out a little bit, which is perfectly normal in untrained voices. And then we get back to this periodic thing. And that would sound a little bit like ah, with that break in the middle there. So you can see there's kind of a lot happening. Looking at measurement of voice now, there are a lot of ways to do this, and an acoustic analysis of the voice is something that is very widely used in voice research. It offers independent, unique, but also complementary data to aerodynamic measures, EGG, and also visualization of the vocal fold. So it is it continues to be an important method for analyzing the voice. Most of the methods, the acoustic methods that we have, were designed for speech and sustained vowels in speakers. Two very common ways of measuring the voice and disturbance in the vocal folds and vocal fold vibration is frequency and amplitude perturbation, and those are respectively jitter and shimmer. And an issue with these two is that they require really accurate tracking of the fundamental frequency. So in highly disordered voices, that's an issue because the fundamental frequency is not very clear, and they really struggle. This is also similar in singing, which we'll see a little bit later. We also have noise measures. So these measure the amount or a ratio of noise in the voice signal, usually maybe harmonics to noise ratio or signal to noise ratio. But apart from glottal leakage or turbulent airflow through the glottis, these measures are sometimes not very specific. So they give us a good sort of global idea of what's happening, but not necessarily actually what the issue is. Then we have Kepstrel measures, and I'm not going to go into depth with this because it's quite sort of intense in terms of analysis, but just briefly, it's the inverse fast Fourier transform of a power spectrum. So this measure itself is quite robust to environmental noise, so it's useful in clinical applications or say fieldwork research. But it's similar in that the physiological correlates to Kepstrel measurements are not always very clear. We see like something like Kepstrel peak prominence or smooth Kepstrel peak prominence. It's got really good correlation with overall perceptual grade of the voice and breathiness. But in terms of what's actually happening to the voice, that's maybe not as clear with these sort of global measures. We also see issues now when we come to frequency and intensity. And this is important to remember that in a clinical setting and in a lot of research settings, and we see this in contemporary research, participants are asked to produce, say, a vowel at a comfortable pitch and intensity. That's going to be different between subjects, between participants, and also within the same person across different time, time of the day, time of the week, time of the month. That'll change, and that's normal. That's in healthy voices, that's completely normal. But a lot of research in the last sort of decade or so has shown that actually there are big effects with frequency and intensity on many acoustic measures. We see Brockman Balsa and her colleagues in several papers looked at the effects of intensity and fundamental frequency and vowel conditions as well on several acoustic parameters, jitter and shimmer, and also Kepstrel peak prominence. And we could see that higher fundamental frequencies, the pitch of the voice, led to worse sort of metrics or higher outcomes in some cases or lower. And also a higher intensity, a louder sound, a more intense sound actually increased or made the measure better and made the outcome better. So depending on the SPL, the volume or the pitch, we might get it. It's just an artifact that metric is actually affected, not because of really any change in the voice, but just because of loudness and frequency. Myself and Micah Brockman-Balsa and also Professor Johan Sundberg conducted a couple of in silico studies where we looked at the effects of frequency, fundamental frequency, and intensity as well, and some singing voice characteristics on acoustic perturbation measures and also cepstral peak prominence. And we saw here these large effects across jitter, this was shimmer, and this is cepstral peak prominence, and the x-axis here is fundamental frequency. So you see that, going higher in fundamental frequency, we get much greater variation in jitter and shimmer, and those are frequency and amplitude perturbation measures that are very widely used. And then in cepstral peak prominence, we get this non-monotonic relationship where cepstral peak prominence increases with fundamental frequency up to about 180 hertz and then decreases again going higher. So in participants with a smallish range, this might not be as much of an issue because we're not going to expect as big a change in fundamental frequency, but we'll see also in singers why this might be an issue. So singers are a unique population of voice users. They have a very high demand, singing at high frequencies or very low frequencies, depending on the voice type, and high intensities or very low intensities for long periods of time. And high demand equals high risk. It's not really associated with genre. Pop singers aren't more at risk than classical singers. It's all about demand and demand response, and that's a really important distinction we make now, to ensure that us classical singers aren't thinking we're somehow better than everyone else, because that's the sort of traditional way of thinking, but actually we haven't seen that in the research. Singers employ wide ranges in frequency and intensity, which, as we see, that might be an issue. There's spectral characteristics, so characteristics in the sound qualities, the timbre of the voice that are specific to certain genres. And the way these characteristics are employed or manifest can also be contextual, that high notes aren't all the same. Even though it's the same frequency, we approach them differently depending on the context of those frequencies or those intensities within that musical phrase. So we see that small changes in the voice and the body have big effects on the sound. And these are important because they allow for really nuanced expression, nuanced communication, and the way we communicate character and feeling and thought. And another important concept is this idea of singers' perception of their own voice as experts, as a ground truth, so that when they sense disorder, when they sense something's wrong, we should listen, because they are the ones who know, and they are highly trained usually, that something is wrong. So it's this, very fine coordination and control and wide ranges that really characterize a singing voice. And it's what makes a professional singing voice user and what characterizes their voice. It's really what sets them apart from speakers. And just to illustrate this a little bit, a couple of little videos here. Just thumbs up if there is sound still. Just so delightful. But there you've got well over 2 octaves of range there. You've got huge differences in intensity as well, in color and timbre, and such an agile voice. And here, this is an amazing example of a diminuendo, a decrease in intensity on a single fundamental frequency, which is not something speakers do naturally. Usually the higher the frequency, the louder the voice, and singers have to learn how to reduce intensity despite fundamental frequency, irrespective. So it's, as a tenor, I'm like, it's ridiculous. And what's amazing is that, it's maybe not, it's a little bit contentious, but from a perceptual sort of view of that sound, that's not flipping into a different register per se. That's not all of a sudden changing into head voice or into falsetto. It's how are they smoothing this out? This is the job, and this is why singing and speaking is not the same, even though the anatomy is the same and technically it's all the same. It's not. So we need specific approaches to singing voice analysis. Another really significant characteristic of the singing voice is vibrato. And this is a quasi-periodic oscillation in fundamental frequency and pitch around a target frequency. It includes aerodynamic, myoelastic, and acoustic interactions, and these aren't actually entirely understood yet, but there has been amazing research to outline these different elements. It's quite a complex phenomenon, actually. Vibrato extent refers to how far the fundamental frequency diverges, or the excursion from a target fundamental frequency, and that's often measured in cents or semitones. And vibrato rate is how fast that excursion happens in the cycle. And vibrato is not unique to classical singing or to operatic singing. We hear it in commercial contemporary music and in popular music, musical theatre, and also in non-Western genres. It's not only in sort of Western opera as we know it, although that is characteristic for sure. And we do see that it's very wide often, or some of the wider vibrato extents in operatic singing. And here we have an example of a spectrogram of a tenor singing a sustained vowel on a pitch, I think it was 256 hertz or so, I think, from memory. Here, this red line is that fundamental frequency oscillation. You see it's quite periodic. The blue line is intensity, and you see actually how it's in phase with the fundamental frequency. So those are resonance harmonics interactions where, because the harmonics align with formant frequencies or sort of vowel resonances, we get a boost in intensity, and when they misalign, we get a dampening in intensity. I'll play it and then talk about it again. You might have heard something halfway there, a little bit interesting. This image isn't spliced together. This tenor adjusted the vocal tract resonances to create the singer's formant cluster, clustering of the third, fourth, and fifth formants, where they come together and form this sort of super cluster and this intensity in this region around 2,500 to 3,500 hertz usually. And you can see the effect also on intensity here, which is quite interesting. I'll just play that again and see if you can hear that sort of high-pitched sound coming in when it... that whistling, and that's what allows a singer to sort of cut through an orchestra or a tenor, and it's usually very characteristic in tenor voices, but it is seen in most singing voices, and also in some operatic non-classical genres, musical theatre, also Chinese Peking opera, and other non-Western genres as well. So, talking about vibrato, well, what's the issue here? I'm just bringing bad news consistently. We also included vibrato extent in these in silico studies, and we saw that the wider the vibrato extent, the worse the measure, or the more disordered the measure appeared. And you can see that this was here jitter, shimmer, and harmonics to noise ratio. These are almost linear effects, so it's very, very clear, and they were quite large effects. And these effects apply to vibrato-like characteristics too. So it's not just a singer's vibrato, but actually, if we're working with participants or patients or clients who have a vocal tremor, such as in Parkinson's disease, that needs to be taken into account. There have been studies that have documented high or lower jitter or shimmer in Parkinson's patients with vocal tremor and without, but who's to say that actually the jitter and shimmer wasn't just a result of these effects? And the reason using an in silico study is so useful in this instance is that we can vary these parameters independently and in a way that we know actually that these are acoustic effects. They're not physiological effects. So it allows us this interesting kind of look into how these measures work. There's also just a natural vibrato in a sustained vowel in the healthy speaking voice, so it's something to consider there too. So this concept of just say ah, if we're working with a singer or the singing voice and we say, okay, comfortable pitch and volume are, we're taking out a lot of the key characteristics of what makes the singing voice a singing voice. If we leave them in, they can confound some of these commonly used analysis methods. So the question to sing or to not to sing, we need to ask, are we sort of taking measurement or subject or participant-centered approaches to the research question? What are we prioritizing there? And also this question, is it acceptable to change the nature of the phenomenon that we're measuring to fit in with the measurement technique? I'll sort of just leave that one open, but I'm sure you all have opinions about that. We can, just to sort of round this up in terms of analyses, using multi-dimensional analyses is a important and useful way to go as well, because it gives a more holistic picture of the voice. There are already existing multi-dimensional indices for the speaking voice, acoustic voice quality index and acoustic breathiness index, for example, and these are have shown really good validity, ecological validity, and they do seem to predict disorder in the speaking voice very well, but they do include parameters such as jitter and shimmer, harmonics to noise ratio, and cepstral peak prominence that as yet aren't being taken into account within these indices. So they need to be done sort of in the analysis and post hoc. And for the singing voice, there's limited, there's, I think, as yet no evidence for use of the singing voice so far. Voice range profiles are fantastic ways to look at the voice, to explore these relationships between fundamental frequency and sound pressure level. They can take a little bit of time to collect all of the data to get a whole picture, but Sten Turnstrom, Peter Pabon have done amazing work with voice range profiles and incorporating also voice metrics into those, so we can see the relationship between fundamental frequency, sound pressure level, and say cepstral peak prominence or whatever correlation dimension, or nonlinear interactions or whatever. They're really fantastic as well for use with the singing voice. Also recently this year, and as a study I conducted, we developed a sort of proof of concept for an aeroacoustic singing fatigue index. So this was a multidimensional index that was actually built on the basis of the singer's perception of their own voice and their own vocal function and health. So using the evaluation of ability to sing easily, we saw which objective measures that we know can be used with the singing voice, or instrumental measures rather, are related to a singer's perception of their own vocal health and vocal function. And we were able to create an index that accounted for 62.5% of variance in those self-reported measures. So we think that's quite good for a psychometric measure to be able to instrumentally kind of show those things. And as a tool to use with those self-reported measures and other instrumental measures of the singing voice, we think that shows great potential in tracking small changes in singing voice function, specifically related to singing fatigue, but also with other things like training effects, looking at the effects of vocal load on the voice, and also treatment effects as well. And what's nice is that it's singing specific. The tasks were to sing soft phonation on a specific frequency, and also vibrato is incorporated in those measures, and an aerodynamic efficiency ratio as well. So much more work is needed on those sorts of things to specifically look at the singing voice and how we can analyze that in various contexts. So just some questions to finish off. How do other singing voice characteristics affect widely applied voice measures? So there haven't been many studies that have actually looked at this. What is affecting Misha's getting very excited. What affects these instrumental measures? Singing formant clusters. Vowels we know affect many measures. How does it work in the singing voice? There's all sorts of avenues that we need to explore. How can advancements in voice measurement better facilitate interdisciplinary research? So the more we learn about the singing voice and how they affect these measures, and the more we develop maybe new tools or refine existing tools, the more we can incorporate them in various avenues of research within music or psychology, linguistics, sociology, and all sorts of ways of looking at the singing voice that aren't as siloed as they have been in the past. And also this question, how can we apply an interdisciplinary gaze to voice science questions? Again, voice science has been quite siloed, and it's sort of often been in the realm of physics or engineering or biomechanics, but actually, looking at the singers themselves as experts. How can we encourage an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approaches to these voice science questions, to look at them in new ways, is going to be really important moving forward. And I'm sure that actually within this group, you're all poised to be doing that sort of research, which is fantastic. So there's my miniature references that you won't be able to see. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'll